In the Alpha's palace, secrets are usually written in blood. But for Rhea, the secret was hidden beneath oversized tunics and a layer of coal dust. She was a girl in a man's world, serving the most powerful Alpha in the territory. She thought she was safe, until the night the Alpha took a wrong turn into the servants' bathhouse. The moon had always been Rhea's only true friend. It was the only witness to her secret, the only light that didn't judge the lies she told just to survive. In the great pack of the Iron Ridge, survival meant being invisible. And for a girl with no family and no status, invisibility meant hiding behind a man's name and a servant's rough tunic. For 3 years, she had been Eli, the quiet stable hand and errand runner. She kept her head down, her voice low, and her curves hidden under layers of oversized wool and coal dust. But tonight, the weight of the disguise felt heavier than usual. The dust of the stables felt like it was choking her skin. She needed to feel human again, even if just for a moment. The servants' bathhouse was a cold, stone building at the edge of the palace grounds. At midnight, it was usually a tomb of shadows. Rhea slipped inside, her heart drumming a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She didn't light a torch, she didn't need to. The moonlight filtered through the high, narrow windows, casting long, silvery ribbons across the water of the central pool. She peeled off the heavy boots, the thick trousers, and the coarse tunic that rubbed her skin raw. With every layer she shed, a bit of the Eli persona fell away. Finally, she stepped into the water. It was freezing, a sharp bite against her skin that made her gasp, but it felt wonderful. It felt real. As she scrubbed the soot from her arms, her long hair, usually braided tight and tucked under a cap, unfurled like dark silk, floating around her in the water. For the first time in weeks, she felt like Rhea. She wasn't a servant. She wasn't a lie. She was just a girl, shimmering under the gaze of the moon. She didn't hear the door creak. She didn't hear the heavy, rhythmic thud of leather boots on the stone floor. Alpha Fenris was a man of shadows and silence. As the leader of the Iron Ridge, his life was a constant storm of politics, border disputes, and the heavy burden of his people's safety. Tonight, the walls of his study had felt like they were closing in. He needed air. He needed a moment where he wasn't the Alpha. He had wandered toward the bathhouse, thinking the cold water might clear the fog of exhaustion from his mind. He expected emptiness. He expected the silence of the stone. Instead, he found a vision. Fenris stopped dead in his tracks. His wolf, usually restless and prowling within his mind, suddenly went still. The air in the room seemed to vanish, replaced by the scent of mountain lilies and rain, a scent that didn't belong in a dusty servant's quarters. Through the rising steam and the pale moonlight, he saw her. She wasn't a male servant. She wasn't Eli. He recognized the profile, the young man who worked the stables, but the person in the water was undeniably, breathtakingly a woman. Her shoulders were soft and pale, her wet hair clinging to her back like a cloak of midnight. She was washing her face, unaware that the most powerful man in the territory was standing 10 feet away, his heart hammering a hole through his chest. Fenris should have been angry. Deception in the Alpha's household was a crime. He should have called the guards. He should have demanded to know who she was and why she was infiltrating his palace. But as he watched her, the anger never came. Instead, a strange, fierce heat bloomed in his chest, a protective instinct so sharp it made his breath hitch. She looked so small in the vast, cold stone room. So fragile, yet her movements possessed a quiet strength that mesmerized him. Rhea turned. The splash of water sounded like a thunderclap in the silence. Her eyes, wide and amber in the moonlight, locked onto his. The world stopped. Rhea's first instinct was to scream, but the sound died in her throat. Her blood turned to ice. She knew that silhouette. The broad shoulders, the towering height, the aura of absolute power that radiated from him even in the dark. Alpha Fenris. She was dead. The thought flashed through her mind with terrifying clarity. He had seen her. The secret was gone. In the laws of the pack, she was a liar, a trespasser. She waited for the roar of his voice, for the guards to burst through the door, for the cold iron of shackles. She sank deeper into the water, her hands trembling as she tried to cover herself, her eyes fixed on his. She was like a deer caught in a hunter's sights, waiting for the final blow. "Please," she whispered. The word was so quiet it barely carried over the water, but with his Alpha hearing, it sounded like a plea to his very soul. Fenris didn't move. He didn't growl. He didn't even frown. He remained standing in the shadows, his eyes burning with an intensity she had never seen before. He wasn't looking at her with disgust. He was looking at her as if he had just discovered a star that had fallen from the sky and landed in his own backyard. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with things unsaid. Rhea could feel the heat of his gaze, a physical sensation that made her skin tingle more than the cold water did. She saw his hand twitch at his side, as if he wanted to reach out, to touch the moonlight on her skin, but he held himself back with a discipline that looked painful. "You," he said finally. His voice was a low vibration, a rumble that seemed to shake the very floor beneath her. It wasn't the voice of a judge. It was the voice of a man who was seeing something beautiful for the very first time. I can explain, Alpha," Rhea stammered, her voice shaking as much as her hands. "Please, I only did it to work, to survive. I meant no harm to the pack." Fenris took a single step forward, emerging from the deep shadows into a sliver of moonlight. His face, usually a mask of granite, was softened by a look of pure wonder. He looked at her wet hair, her frightened eyes, and the way the water rippled around her. "How long?" he asked softly. 3 years, she whispered. A flicker of something crossed his face. Is pain? Admiration? He thought of the girl living in the rough stables, sleeping on hay, hiding her beauty and her voice behind a mask of soot and silence. She had been right under his nose, a diamond hidden in the dirt, and he hadn't seen her. 3 years you have lived in my house as a ghost," Fenris said, his voice dropping to a whisper. He wasn't looking at her identity, he was looking at her. He saw the curve of her jaw, the intelligence in her eyes, and the sheer bravery it must have taken to live this lie. Rhea waited for the but. "But you have lied. But you must be punished." Instead, Fenris did something she never expected. He took off his heavy fur-lined cloak. With a slow, deliberate movement, he walked to the edge of the pool. Rhea flinched, pulling back, but he stopped. He knelt on the cold stone, his eyes never leaving hers, and laid the cloak on the edge of the water. "The water is cold," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "You will catch a chill." Rhea stared at the cloak. It was the Alpha's cloak, made of the finest wool and lined with the softest wolf fur. It was a symbol of his office, his power. And he was offering it to a maid. To a liar. "I am not going to hurt you, Rhea," he said. Her heart skipped a beat. He used her real name. She hadn't heard her own name spoken aloud in years. It sounded like music coming from him. "You know who I am," she breathed. "I know you are the one who tends my horses with more care than anyone else," he said. "I know you are the one who quieted the frantic foal last winter when no one else could. I didn't know your name, but I know your spirit." He stood up slowly, giving her space, showing her that he was not a threat. The usual Alpha dominance was tucked away, replaced by a raw, quiet reverence. "Cover yourself," he said softly, turning his back to her to give her privacy. "Dress. Go back to your quarters. Use the back path, the guards won't see you there." Rhea scrambled out of the water, her movements frantic as she grabbed his cloak and wrapped it around her. It was heavy and warm, smelling of cedarwood, rain, and him. It felt like a shield. It felt like safety. She dressed in her old, ragged clothes with trembling fingers, but she kept the cloak wrapped tightly over her shoulders. When she was done, she looked at his broad back. He was still standing there, waiting, guarding her privacy. "Alpha," she called out. Fenris turned. He looked at her, this small, brave girl wrapped in his massive cloak. A small, rare smile touched the corners of his lips. It wasn't a smile of triumph, but one of discovery. "Your secret is safe with me, Rhea," he promised. "Tonight, I didn't see a servant. I saw a miracle." Rhea didn't know what to say. Her world had been turned upside down. She had entered the bathhouse as a hidden maid and was leaving as the keeper of the Alpha's heart, though she didn't know it yet. As she slipped out into the night, the cold wind didn't bite. She was wrapped in his warmth, and for the first time in 3 years, the moon wasn't her only friend. Fenris stood in the empty bathhouse for a long time after she left, the scent of lilies still hanging in the air. His wolf was no longer restless. It was sure. It was settled. He had found what he didn't know he was looking for. And he would do anything to keep her safe. The game had changed. The veil was lifted. And the Alpha had a new purpose. The sun rose over the Iron Ridge the next morning, but for Rhea, the world felt entirely different. Every time a guard walked past or a senior servant barked an order, she flinched, expecting the heavy hand of justice to fall on her shoulder. She had returned his cloak to the stone bench before slipping away, but the scent of cedar and rain seemed to have soaked into her very soul. She kept her head low, her cap pulled tight over her ears, waiting for the whistle that would signal her arrest. But the whistle never came. Instead, as the morning mist cleared, the head housekeeper, a stern woman named Martha, found Rhea in the stables. "Eli." Martha called out, her voice echoing against the wooden beams. "Drop that shovel. The Alpha has requested a change in your duties. You're to report to the private wing immediately." Rhea's heart did a slow, painful roll in her chest. This is it, she thought. He didn't want to make a scene in the bathhouse. He's going to deal with me privately. She followed Martha through the grand corridors of the palace, her heavy boots clunking awkwardly on the polished marble. This was a world she usually only saw from the service entrances. When they reached the heavy oak doors of the Alpha's private study, Martha knocked once and then scurried away, leaving Rhea standing alone in the hallway. "Come in," a deep voice rumbled from behind the wood. Rhea pushed the door open. The room was vast, filled with the scent of old parchment and wood smoke. Alpha Fenris was seated behind a massive desk covered in maps and reports. He didn't look up immediately. He looked exactly as he always did, the stern, untouchable leader of the pack. "The bookshelves in the corner," Fenris said, his voice level and professional. "They've gathered dust. Organize them by date. It is light work, but it requires attention to detail. Do you understand?" "Yes, Alpha," Rhea whispered, her voice cracking slightly. She moved to the corner, her back to him, and began to work. Her hands were shaking so much she nearly dropped the first book she touched. She waited for him to say something, to demand an explanation, to threaten her, or to mock her. But he said nothing. He simply went back to his writing. The only sound in the room was the scratching of his quill and the soft rustle of Rhea's movements. Hours passed. It was the strangest torture Rhea had ever endured. She could feel his presence behind her like a physical heat. Every now and then, she would catch the sound of his breathing changing, as if he were about to speak, but the silence remained unbroken. It was a silent agreement. In this room, she was safe. In this room, the secret was a bridge between them rather than a wall. When the clock struck noon, Fenris stood up. "I have a meeting with the council. You may finish for the day once that shelf is done." He walked toward the door, but as he passed her, he slowed down. He didn't stop, and he didn't look at her, but his hand briefly brushed against the shelf next to her shoulder. "There is a tray on the side table," he said quietly, his voice losing its formal edge. "The kitchen sent too much. It would be a waste to throw it away." Then, he was gone. Rhea turned to the side table. It wasn't a standard servant's meal of stale bread and thin broth. On the silver tray sat a plate of roasted chicken, fresh greens, and a small bowl of berries dusted with sugar. There was also a flagon of sweet apple juice. It was a meal fit for a noble. She looked at the door, then back at the food. Tears pricked her eyes. He wasn't punishing her. He was feeding her. Over the next week, the pattern continued. Every morning, Eli was called to the private wing. The tasks were always simple. Polishing silver, sorting scrolls, or simply tending to the fire in the study. It was light duty, a far cry from the back-breaking labor of the stables. And the gifts continued, though they were never called gifts. One afternoon, she arrived to find a new wool blanket folded neatly on the chair where she usually sat to work. It was thick, dyed a deep forest green, and far warmer than the threadbare rag she slept under in the servants' quarters. The storage rooms were overflowing, Fenris remarked from his desk, not looking up from a map. Martha was going to burn the old stock. Take it if you wish. Rhea touched the soft wool. She knew Martha didn't burn old stock, every scrap was accounted for in the iron ridge. She knew this blanket was new. She knew he had ordered it specifically. Thank you, Alpha, she said softly. He grunted in response, but she saw the slight softening of his jaw. From his desk, Fenris watched her. He was a man who had spent his life studying his enemies and his allies, but he had never studied anyone as intently as he studied Rhea. He watched the way she moved, the way she was slowly losing the defensive hunch in her shoulders. He watched the way her small hands handled the ancient books with a reverence that most of his warriors lacked. He was fascinated by her. He knew the story of her family, a minor house that had fallen into debt and disappeared. He realized now that she hadn't just been surviving, she had been protecting the memory of who she was by hiding it in plain sight. Her resilience was a flame that burned brighter than any torch in his palace. Sometimes, he would intentionally stay late at his desk just to listen to her hum softly to herself while she worked. She thought he wasn't paying attention, but he heard every note. It was a beautiful, haunting sound that made the heavy burden of his crown feel a little lighter. One evening, a storm rolled in over the mountains. The wind howled against the stone walls of the palace, and thunder shook the foundations. Rhea was finishing her work, preparing to head back to the drafty, cold servants' wing. Fenris stood by the window, watching the rain lash against the glass. He turned as she reached for the door. The servants' quarters leak during storms like this, don't they? He asked. Rhea paused, her hand on the cold iron handle. Sometimes, Alpha. The roof is old. Fenris frowned. He hated the thought of her shivering in a damp room, hiding under his blanket while water dripped from the ceiling. He wanted to tell her to stay. He wanted to pull her to the hearth and wrap her in his own arms until the storm passed. But he knew he couldn't. Not yet. The secret was their sanctuary, but it was also their cage. He walked over to a small cabinet and pulled out a pair of thick, leather-soled slippers. These were a gift from a southern merchant. Too small for me. Give them to one of the other boys. Or keep them. Cold feet lead to a cold heart. He walked closer to her than he ever had in the study. Rhea held her breath. He was so tall, so solid. He reached out, his hand hovering near her cheek for a split second before he dropped it and handed her the slippers. Sleep well, Rhea, he whispered. It was the first time he had used her name since the bathhouse. The sound of it sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with the storm outside. Sleep well, Alpha, she replied. As she walked back through the darkened halls, clutching the warm slippers and thinking of the forest green blanket waiting for her, Rhea realized that the Eli she had been pretending to be was starting to dissolve. She was no longer just a maid in disguise. She was a girl being seen, really seen, for the first time in her life. And Fenris, sitting back down at his desk in the flickering candlelight, stared at the spot where she had been standing. He didn't care about the maps or the borders anymore. He realized that his greatest duty wasn't just to the pack. It was to the girl who had accidentally walked into his life and stolen his peace. The agreement was silent, but it was becoming the loudest thing in the palace. He would provide, and she would thrive. He would watch, and she would shine. In the heart of the Iron Ridge, amidst the cold stone and the winter storms, a quiet, unbreakable affection was taking root, a love that didn't need words to be understood. The library of the Iron Ridge was a place of ancient echoes and the dry, sweet scent of aging paper. It was a cathedral of knowledge, and for Rhea, it was the most beautiful room she had ever seen. On this afternoon, the golden sun streamed through the tall, arched windows, dancing with the dust motes that floated in the air. Alpha Fenris was at his usual table, but he wasn't looking at his ledgers. He was watching Rhea. She was perched on a small stool, carefully wiping the spine of a massive, leather-bound volume. She moved with a grace that she no longer tried to hide when they were alone. The heavy Eli boots were replaced by the soft leather slippers he had given her, and she moved as silently as a cat. "That book," Fenris said, his voice breaking the comfortable silence. "It's a history of the Southern Isles. Most people find it incredibly boring." Rhea started slightly, then looked down at the book in her lap. A small, genuine smile lit up her face, a sight that made Fenris's heart skip a beat. "It isn't boring at all, Alpha," she said, her voice growing bolder. "It talks about the Star Readers and the way they used the tides to build their cities. Did you know they believed the moon wasn't just a light, but a mother watching over the ocean?" Fenris leaned back, surprised. "I thought you were just cleaning the dust, Rhea." "I didn't realize you were reading the secrets inside." Rhea blushed, looking down. "I shouldn't have. It's not my place to fill my head with such things." "And why is that?" Fenris asked, his tone curious, not accusing. "A maid needs to know how to scrub a floor and mend a tunic," she replied softly. "She doesn't need to know about the stars or the ancient kings." Fenris stood up and walked toward her. He didn't stop until he was standing just a few feet away. "A person's place is a cage made of other people's words, Rhea. Your mind is clearly not meant for cages." For the next hour, the Alpha and the Maid disappeared. They became two people lost in a world of ideas. Fenris questioned her on the books she had handled, and he was floored by her answers. She was quick-witted, she had a memory like a steel trap, and she saw the world with a poetic clarity that he, burdened by the cold logic of leadership, had long ago forgotten. She made a joke about a particularly pompous historian that made Fenris laugh, a deep, booming sound that echoed off the high ceiling. It was a sound his guards hadn't heard in years. "You have a sharp tongue, Rhea," he said, his eyes crinkling with amusement. "Only when I'm in good company, Alpha," she countered, her eyes sparkling with a newfound confidence. The air between them changed. It was no longer just about secrets or safety. It was about a connection that went deeper than words. Rhea turned back to the shelves, her heart racing from the sound of his laughter. "There is one more volume at the very top," she said, reaching up. "The record of the first Alpha. It looks neglected." She stood on her tiptoes, stretching her arm as far as it would go. The stool wobbled beneath her. "Careful," Fenris said, moving instinctively. He stepped into her space, his large frame surrounding her like a warm shadow. He reached up, his arm easily passing hers to grasp the heavy book. But as he pulled it from the shelf, his other hand came down to steady her. His hand covered hers on the edge of the mahogany shelf. The moment their skin met, the world vanished. It wasn't just a touch. It was a revelation. A jolt of pure, white-hot energy shot through Rhea's arm, straight to her heart. It felt like 1,000 tiny stars exploding under her skin. It was warm, it was ancient, and it was undeniable. The mate bond. The legend said that when two souls meant for each other finally touched, the Great Spirit would light a fire that could never be put out. Rhea gasped, her breath catching in her throat. She looked up, and she saw the same shock reflected in Fenris's eyes. His pupils had blown wide, his dark irises nearly swallowed by the blackness of his wolf's recognition. He didn't pull his hand away. Instead, his fingers tightened slightly, anchoring her to him. Rhea, he whispered, and the way he said her name this time was different. It wasn't a question or a command. It was a vow. The library was silent, but the air was humming with the power of the bond. In that single touch, the silent agreement had turned into something much more powerful. Fenris realized that he didn't just want to protect her. He belonged to her. Rhea felt the fear of her secret finally dissolve. How could she be afraid when her very soul was singing in harmony with his? He lowered the book, but he didn't move his hand from hers. They stood there, caught in the golden afternoon light, two halves of a whole finally finding their place. I found it, Fenris murmured, his gaze dropping to her lips and then back to her eyes. The book? Rhea asked, her voice trembling. No, Fenris replied, his voice thick with emotion. I found you. In that moment, among the whispers of the library and the scent of old dreams, the Maid and the Alpha knew that their story was only just beginning. And this time, there would be no more hiding. The library had been a sanctuary of golden light and soul-deep recognition, but the world outside those oak doors didn't stop for the heart's revelations. 2 days later, duty tore Fenris away. A border dispute with a neighboring pack required his presence, his strength, and his unyielding authority. For Rhea, those days were a hollow ache. She returned to her Eli persona, but it felt like wearing a skin that no longer fit. She moved through the stables and the halls like a ghost, her hands still tingling where he had touched her. She found herself constantly looking toward the main gates, her ears straining for the sound of his horse's hooves. The Alpha returned under the cover of a moonless midnight. There was no victory parade, no blowing of horns. There was only the sound of heavy footsteps and the worried whispers of his lead commander. Rhea, who had been unable to sleep, was cleaning the lamps in the hallway near the private wing when the doors swung open. Fenris looked like a fallen god. His armor was caked with dried mud and something darker, blood. His face was pale, his jaw set in a line of grim endurance. He was leaning slightly to the left, his hand pressed against his side. When his eyes met Rhea's through the flickering lamplight, the mask of the stoic leader cracked for just a second. Alpha. The commander urged, reaching out to help him. Let us call the pack healers. That blade was deep. No, Fenris growled, his voice like grinding stones. It was a sound of pure, stubborn pain. I want no one. Send them away. I will rest, and it will heal. But Alpha? Go. Fenris commanded, a flash of his Alpha power flaring in his eyes. The guards hesitated, then bowed and retreated. They knew better than to argue with a wounded wolf. But as they left, Fenris didn't move toward his bed. He stayed leaned against the doorframe, his breathing ragged. Rhea didn't think. She didn't worry about her disguise or the rules. She dropped her cleaning cloth and rushed to him. Fenris, she breathed, using his name without the title for the first time. He didn't correct her. He let out a long, shuddering breath and allowed his weight to slump toward her. Rhea caught him, her small frame straining under his massive size. She guided him into his private chambers, the door clicking shut behind them, sealing out the rest of the world. She helped him sit on the edge of the large, fur-covered bed. He groaned, a sound of raw vulnerability that pierced her heart. Where is she asked, her hands already reaching for the buckles of his blood-stained chest plate. My side, he managed to say, his eyes fluttering shut. A stray blade, a lucky hit. Rhea's fingers worked with a frantic, focused energy. She had spent years tending to injured horses in the stables. She knew that fear was a luxury she couldn't afford. She peeled back the layers of leather and wool, her breath hitching when she saw the wound. It was a jagged tear along his ribs, angry and red, the blood still oozing slowly. "I need water," she murmured, more to herself than him. "And the clean linens from the wash basin." She moved with the grace of a shadow, returning moments later with everything she needed. Fenris had laid back against the pillows, his chest heaving. In the dim candlelight, he looked less like the terrifying Alpha of the Iron Ridge and more like a man in desperate need of a soft place to land. Rhea knelt on the bed beside him. She took a cloth, dipped it in the warm water, and began to wash the blood away. "This will sting," she whispered. "Nothing could hurt more than the silence of these last few days," he whispered back, his eyes opening to find hers. As she worked, the room became a cocoon of sensory details. The steam rising from the water, the scent of metallic blood mixed with his cedarwood musk, and the soft, rhythmic sound of their breathing. Rhea was so gentle, her fingers barely skimming his skin as she cleaned the edges of the cut. Fenris watched her. He felt the sting, yes, but he also felt the incredible warmth of her care. Her hands were small, but they were steady. He felt the softness of her palms against his heated skin, and a different kind of ache began to build in his chest, an ache of longing. He reached out with his good arm and lightly touched the back of her head, his fingers tangling in the short, dark hair she kept hidden. "You should be sleeping," he murmured. "I couldn't sleep while you were bleeding in the dark," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. She began to apply a soothing herbal salve she had taken from the stables. A remedy meant for the most expensive stallions, but pure and healing. Her touch was a caress, a silent language of affection. She was healing his body, but the way she looked at him, with such fierce, unwavering devotion, was healing something much deeper. "Rhea," he groaned, but it wasn't from pain. He leaned into her touch, his forehead resting against her shoulder as she began to wrap the clean white linens around his torso. The powerful Alpha, the man who held the fate of thousands in his hands, was making himself small for her. He was letting her see the blood, the weakness, and the hidden wound. "Why me?" she asked softly as she tied the final knot in the bandage. "Why not the healers? They have better medicines. They have magic." Fenris pulled back just enough to look into her amber eyes. He reached up, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw, moving over the smudge of soot she had forgotten to wash off her cheek. "Because magic cannot give me peace," he said, his voice a low, vibrating hum. "The healers see an Alpha. My council sees a crown. My enemies see a target." He paused, his gaze softening with a tenderness that made Rhea's heart melt. "But you see me. Just Fenris. And when your hands are on me, the world stops being a battlefield. For the first time in my life, I feel safe." Rhea felt a tear escape and trail down her cheek. She leaned forward, pressing her forehead against his. The mate bond they had felt in the library was no longer a spark, it was a steady, burning hearth. "You are safe here," she promised. "I won't let the world in tonight." Fenris sighed, a long release of years of tension. He lay back, pulling her down with him. He didn't ask her to leave. He didn't mention the rules or the scandal it would cause if a male servant were found in the Alpha's bed. He simply wrapped his arm around her, tucking her head under his chin. Rhea listened to the steady, strong beat of his heart. It was a drum she wanted to follow for the rest of her life. The night was cold and the mountains were unforgiving, but inside the Alpha's chambers, there was only the warmth of two souls finding their rhythm. The wound would heal, the scar would remain, but the bond formed in the quiet of the night was now unbreakable. The powerful Alpha slept, guarded not by 100 warriors, but by the gentle heart of a maid who loved him. And Rhea, wrapped in his scent and his strength, finally understood that her disguise didn't matter. She wasn't hiding anymore. She was exactly where she was meant to be. The wound on Fenris's side healed quickly, leaving behind a silver scar that he viewed not as a mark of battle, but as a reminder of the night Rhea had truly become his. But as the days passed, a new kind of restlessness grew within him. He was tired of the shadows. He was tired of seeing her in those heavy, soot-stained clothes, eating scraps in the drafty servants' hall while he sat at a table of gold. One evening, he decided to change the rules of their secret world. Rhea arrived at the private study for her usual evening duties, expecting to find the Alpha buried in maps. Instead, the large oak table had been cleared of scrolls and replaced with a white linen cloth. 2 silver plates sat opposite each other, and the air was thick with the scent of roasted rosemary lamb and sweet honey cakes. Fenris stood by the fireplace, his hands behind his back. He looked different, relaxed, almost nervous. "Alpha?" Rhea asked, her voice small. "Is there a guest arriving? I can leave if you need the room." "There is a guest," Fenris said, turning to her with a soft light in his eyes. "But she is already here." Rhea looked around the empty room, confused. "I don't understand." "The kitchen staff has been experimental lately," Fenris lied, though the corners of his mouth twitched with a hidden smile. "I cannot risk being poisoned or simply having a bad meal before the council meeting tomorrow. I require someone to test the food." "Sit, Eli." Rhea stared at the chair. It was a chair of carved velvet, meant for high-ranking lords. "I couldn't. If anyone saw." "The doors are locked, and the guards have been dismissed for the hour," Fenris interrupted gently. "Tonight, the only eyes in this room are mine. And I am tired of eating alone." It was a royal invitation wrapped in a humble excuse. Rhea hesitated, then slowly sat. As she did, Fenris didn't sit immediately. He walked around the table and, with the grace of a true gentleman, pushed her chair in for her. The simple gesture made Rhea's breath hitch. No one had ever treated her with such delicate respect. "Eat," he commanded softly, sitting across from her. For the first few minutes, the only sound was the clinking of silver against china. Rhea felt out of place, her rough, stained hands looking like a crime against the beautiful table. But Fenris didn't look at her hands. He looked at her face, watching the way her eyes widened as she tasted the rich, seasoned lamb. "Better than the stable broth," he teased. "Much better," she whispered, a small laugh escaping her. As the tension melted away under the warmth of the fire and the good food, the conversation shifted. It wasn't about the pack or the borders anymore. "Tell me about before," Fenris said, leaning back. "Before you were Eli. Who was Rhea?" Rhea looked into the dancing flames of the hearth, her expression turning distant and wistful. "I was a girl who loved the library in my father's house. We were a small house, but we were happy. My father was a scholar, a man who believed that words were stronger than claws." She told him the story she had kept locked away for 3 years. She spoke of the night the debt collectors and the rival shadows came, not with blades, but with papers that stripped her family of everything. Her father had died of a broken heart, and her mother had followed soon after. "I was 14, Rhea said, her voice trembling slightly. "I had no brothers, no protectors. I knew that a young girl alone would be hunted. So, I took my father's oldest tunic, cut my hair with a kitchen knife, and walked toward the Iron Ridge. I thought if I could just be a shadow, I could survive." Fenris listened in a silence so profound it felt like the room itself was holding its breath. He had seen many kinds of bravery, warriors charging into certain death, mothers protecting their pups, but he had never heard of a courage as quiet and sustained as hers. To live a lie every single hour of every single day just to keep a flame of her family's dignity alive, it was staggering. "You did all of that alone," Fenris murmured, his heart aching with a mixture of pain and pride. "I wasn't alone," she said, looking up at him. "I had my father's books in my head. And then I had you, even before you knew it. Watching you lead, seeing how you cared for the pack even when you were exhausted, it gave me a reason to keep going. I wanted to serve a man like you." Fenris reached across the table. This time, he didn't care about the silver or the food. He took her hand in his his thumb stroking over her knuckles. He didn't see the dirt or the calluses. He saw a queen who had survived a winter that would have frozen most men's souls. "You were never just a servant, Rhea," he said, his voice thick with a new level of admiration. "You are the strongest person in this palace. My warriors have shields of iron, but you have a shield of spirit." The meal continued, but the food testing was forgotten. They shared stories of childhood. Fenris spoke of the pressure of being an Alpha's son, the lonely nights spent training until his hands bled, and the fear that he would never be enough for his people. In that small, private room, they weren't an Alpha and a Maid. They were two orphans of a sort, two souls who had been forced to grow up too fast, finally finding a place where they could just be. Fenris stood up and walked to a small cabinet. He returned with a single, honey-glazed pear on a crystal dish. He sliced a piece and offered it to her. "A lady should always have dessert," he said softly. Rhea took the bite, the sweetness exploding on her tongue, but it was nothing compared to the sweetness of being seen. As she looked at Fenris, she saw the way he was looking at her, not with pity, but with a fierce, burning respect. "Why are you doing this, Fenris?" she asked. "I'm still just a stable hand to the rest of the world." "Because to me, you are the world," he replied simply. He didn't need to say more. The admiration in his eyes was a coronation in itself. As the fire died down to glowing embers, Rhea realized that the girl she used to be wasn't just a memory anymore. She was coming back to life, nurtured by the gaze of the man who had seen through her disguise and decided that the truth was even more beautiful than the lie. They sat together in the fading light, the royal invitation becoming a promise. One day, she wouldn't have to sit in the dark. One day, he would show the whole world what he already knew. That the greatest treasure of the Iron Ridge had been hiding in the stables all along. The moon was a silver coin tossed into a velvet sky, casting long, elegant shadows over the private courtyard of the Alpha's palace. It was a place of high stone walls and climbing white roses that only bloomed at night. Usually, this place was silent, reserved for the Alpha's private reflections. But tonight, the air felt electric, humming with a melody that only two hearts could hear. Rhea had been summoned there under the pretext of checking the evening lanterns, but when she arrived, she found Fenris standing in the center of the mosaic floor. He wasn't wearing his heavy furs or his ceremonial armor. He wore a simple black tunic, his dark hair ruffled by the cool mountain breeze. "The lanterns are already lit, Alpha," Rhea said, her voice a soft flutter in the stillness. She felt small in her oversized servant's clothes, her hands tucked into her sleeves. "I didn't bring you here for the lights, Rhea," he said. He walked toward her, his footsteps silent on the stone. He stopped just inches away, the scent of cedarwood and the cold night air surrounding her. "I brought you here because I heard a rumor that the daughter of a scholar never learned to dance." Rhea looked down at her heavy, scuffed boots. "My father was a man of books, not ballrooms. And Eli certainly has no business dancing." "Eli is not here," Fenris said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate vibration. He reached out, his hand hovering near her face before he gently tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear. His touch was like a spark of fire in the frost. "Only you are here. And I think it is time we stop pretending, even in the shadows." He stepped back and held out his hand. It was a silent request, an invitation into a world she had only ever watched from the corners of drafty halls. "I don't know how," she whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I will lead," he promised. "Trust me." Rhea placed her hand in his. His palm was large and warm, his fingers closing around hers with a protective strength that made her feel like she was the most precious thing in the kingdom. He placed his other hand firmly but gently on the small of her back, drawing her closer until the tips of her boots touched his. "There is no music," she breathed, her eyes locked on his dark, shimmering gaze. "Listen," he murmured. "The wind in the pines, the fountain in the corner, the beat of your own heart, that is all the music we need." He began to move. It wasn't a fast dance, It was a slow, swaying rhythm that felt as natural as the tide. At first, Rhea was stiff, terrified of tripping over her own feet or his. But Fenris held her with such steady grace that she found herself leaning into him, her head resting just below his chin. As they moved across the moonlit stones, the world outside the courtyard walls ceased to exist. There were no pacts, no debts, no disguises. There was only the silver light and the heat of his body against hers. "You are so light," he whispered, his breath tickling her temple. "Like a bird that has forgotten it has wings." He spun her slowly, his hand never letting go of hers. As she turned, the moonlight caught the amber in her eyes, and for a moment, she felt beautiful. Not Eli, the stable hand. Not the hidden maid. But Rhea. Fenris stopped moving, but he didn't let her go. He kept his arms wrapped around her, holding her in the center of the starlight. He looked down at her, his expression raw and filled with an emotion so deep it looked like pain. "I want to say it out loud," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "I want the moon to hear it so I can never take it back." Rhea held her breath. "I know who you are," he said, his eyes searching hers. "I see the woman who has carried the weight of the world on her shoulders without complaining. I see the girl who finds beauty in old books and kindness in a cold stable. You are a woman, Rhea. A beautiful, brave, incredible woman." The words hit her like a physical wave. To hear him say it. To have the lie finally stripped away not with anger, but with such profound tenderness, made the tears she had been holding back for 3 years finally spill over. "You don't have to hide from me," Fenris continued, his thumb brushing away a tear from her cheek. "Not ever again. In this palace, in this pack, and in my heart, you are safe. You are seen. I don't want a servant, Rhea. I don't want a shadow. I want you. But the pack, the laws." She sobbed softly, her hands clutching his tunic. "I am the law," Fenris said with a fierce, quiet authority. "And I will change every rule in this land before I let you disappear again. You are mine, and I am yours. The moon is our witness." He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. In the silence of the courtyard, the bond between them pulsed like a living thing. It was a moment of pure, crystalline romance, a promise made in the dark that would light the rest of their lives. Rhea closed her eyes, breathing in the scent of him, feeling the strength of his arms and the sincerity of his words. The starlight dance wasn't just a series of steps on stone. It was the moment she finally came home. "Teach me more," she whispered. "I will teach you everything," he replied. "We have all the time in the world." And there, under the watchful eyes of the stars, the Alpha and his maid danced on. Not because they had to, but because for the first time in their lives, they were both finally free. The whispers in the Iron Ridge Palace were like a rising tide. For weeks, the servants had watched Eli be summoned to the private wing day after day. They saw the light duties that kept the stable hand away from the hay and the muck. They saw the way the Alpha's eyes followed the boy across the room. In a world built on hierarchy, favoritism was a spark in a dry forest. One morning, Rhea was carrying a stack of scrolls through the servants' hall. A group of older workers, led by a man named Silas, blocked her path. Silas had been the head stable hand before Eli arrived, and his bitterness had been festering. "Moving up in the world, are we, Eli?" Silas sneered, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Too good for the horses now? Too soft for the real work?" Rhea kept her head down. "The Alpha has tasks for me, Silas. I only go where I am told." "Maybe you're telling him things he likes to hear," another servant chimed in. "A little spy for the Alpha, maybe?" They crowded around her, their shadows long and intimidating. Rhea felt the old panic rising, the fear that if they pushed too hard, if they grabbed her, her secret would be ripped away in the middle of a hallway. "Give us those scrolls," Silas demanded, reaching for them. "Let's see what's so important that a stable boy has to handle it." No, Rhea said, her voice small but firm. Just as Silas reached out to shove her, the air in the hallway changed. A sudden, heavy silence fell, so thick it felt like the walls were closing in. It was the weight of a predator's gaze. Is there a problem here? The voice was low, like the growl of thunder before a storm. Alpha Fenris was standing at the end of the hall, his presence filling the space. He didn't look angry, he looked absolute. His power radiated off him in waves, making the servants drop their eyes and bow their heads in an instant. Silas stepped back, his face turning pale. No, Alpha. We were just checking on the boy's progress. Fenris walked forward, the sound of his boots on the stone floor rhythmic and terrifying. He didn't stop until he was standing directly in front of Rhea. He didn't look at the others, he looked only at her. Eli, he said, his voice softening just enough for her to hear the care behind the command. Did they touch you? No, Alpha, she whispered. Fenris turned his gaze to the crowd. He didn't raise his voice, but the authority in it was undeniable. This worker is under my direct command. His duties are my business. His safety is my responsibility. If any among you have a question about my choices, you may bring it to me directly in the throne room. The servants trembled. To challenge an Alpha was a death wish. But know this, Fenris added, his eyes flashing with a protective fire. To lay a hand on him is to lay a hand on me. To disrespect him is to disrespect the crest of the Iron Ridge. Am I understood? Yes, Alpha, they murmured in unison, scurrying away as if the floor were on fire. Fenris didn't leave. He waited until the hallway was empty, then he stepped closer to Rhea. He reached out, his hand pausing for a second before he remembered they were in public. He couldn't touch her face, but he could do something else. Come with me, he said. He led her to a small alcove, hidden from view. From his pocket, he pulled out a small, velvet pouch. Inside was a necklace, a silver chain with a heavy pendant. It was the crest of his house, a wolf howling at a silver moon. This is my personal mark, Fenris said, his voice thick with emotion. Only my inner circle, my family, and my most trusted advisors wear this. It is a sign to everyone in this pack that you belong to me. That you are under my shadow. He stepped behind her. Rhea felt the cool metal of the chain against her neck as he fastened it. His fingers brushed against the sensitive skin of her nape, sending a shiver of pure affection through her. You don't have to be afraid of them, Rhea, he whispered into her ear. They see a servant, but I see my heart. Wear this under your tunic for now, but know that its weight is my promise to you. No one will ever hurt you while I draw breath. Rhea touched the cold silver pendant through her shirt. It felt warm against her skin, as if his very strength had been poured into the metal. She looked up at him, her eyes shining with tears of gratitude. I've spent so long trying to be nothing, she whispered. And you make me feel like I'm everything. To me, you are, he replied. The conflict with the staff had tried to bring her down, but Fenris had used it to build a fortress around her. The necklace was a secret crown, a public sign of a love that was becoming too powerful to stay hidden. In the heart of the Iron Ridge, the protection of the Alpha wasn't just a law, it was a sanctuary. The night of the Great Equinox Feast was usually a time of roaring fires, loud boasts from warriors, and the frantic scurrying of servants. But tonight, the air inside the Great Hall of the Iron Ridge felt different. It was thick with a mystery that no one could quite name. The rumor mill had been working overtime. Eli, the Alpha's favorite stable hand, had not been seen since dawn. More strangely, the Alpha himself had spent the afternoon in a mood of quiet, intense anticipation, pacing the battlements like a wolf waiting for the moon to rise. In a small, sun-drenched room in the private wing, a room that used to be a guest chamber but was now Rhea's sanctuary, the transformation was nearly complete. On the bed lay a gown that seemed to have been woven from the very stars they had danced under nights before. It was a deep, shimmering blue, the color of the mountain sky just before the sun disappears. The fabric was silk, so soft it felt like a second skin. Beside it sat a pair of delicate silver slippers and a comb made of polished bone. Rhea stood before the tall mirror, her breath hitching. For the first time in 3 long years, the coal dust was gone. Her skin, nurtured by the creams and soaps Fenris had secretly provided, glowed with a healthy, pale luster. But the biggest change was her hair. She had let it down. It fell in dark, wavy silk past her shoulders, framing a face that was no longer a mask of exhaustion, but a portrait of grace. She felt like she was waking up from a long, cold dream. She stepped into the dress, the silk whispering against her legs. As she fastened the silver necklace, the one with Fenris's crest, she realized she wasn't hiding the pendant under a tunic anymore. It sat proudly against her collarbone, a shining declaration of where she belonged. Today, she whispered to her reflection, the shadow becomes the light. Meanwhile, the great hall was overflowing. Hundreds of pack members sat at the long wooden tables. At the high table sat Fenris. He looked magnificent in his formal furs, but his eyes were constantly fixed on the grand staircase at the back of the hall. He wasn't listening to the elders or the commanders. He was waiting for his heart to walk through the door. Then, the heavy oak doors at the top of the stairs creaked open. The herald, a man who had been briefed by Fenris personally, stepped forward. He didn't call out the name of a boy. He didn't call out a servant. Presenting, he announced, his voice echoing to the very rafters, the Lady Rhea of the House of Valerius. Honored guest of the Alpha. The silence that followed was so absolute you could hear the flickering of the torches. Rhea stepped into the light. She moved with a slow, trembling dignity. As she descended the stairs, the blue silk of her gown rippled like water. The common room was a sea of stunned faces. Martha, the housekeeper, dropped a silver tray, the clatter sounding like a gunshot. Silas, the man who had bullied Eli in the hallway, sat with his mouth hanging open, his eyes bugging out as he realized the boy he had tried to shove was the ethereal woman walking past him. They saw the hair. They saw the eyes. And then, they saw the silver necklace. A ripple of whispers broke the silence. Is that Eli? No, it can't be. Look at her, she's beautiful. Look at the crest. She wears the Alpha's mark. Rhea kept her eyes fixed on one person. Fenris. He had stood up the moment she appeared. As she reached the bottom of the stairs, he walked toward her. He didn't care about the stairs or the shocked murmurs of his council. He walked with the pride of a king approaching his queen. When he reached her, he didn't bow as a host to a guest. He took her hand in his fingers interlaced with hers, and brought her knuckles to his lips for a long, lingering kiss. You are more beautiful than the moon itself, he whispered, loud enough only for her to hear. Then, he turned to face his people. He didn't let go of her hand. In fact, he pulled her slightly closer, his arm brushing against hers in a gesture of absolute possession and protection. Members of the Iron Ridge, Fenris began, his voice booming with a power that commanded instant loyalty. For 3 years, a light lived among us in the shadows. For 3 years, this woman showed a bravery and a resilience that puts many of our strongest warriors to shame. She protected her family's honor by becoming a ghost in our halls. He looked down at Rhea, his eyes shining with a pride that made her heart soar. She is no longer a ghost. She is Rhea. She is a daughter of the Southern Isles, a survivor of the winter, and from this day forward, she is the most honored guest of my house. She is under my protection, she is my equal in conversation, and she holds the key to the Alpha's gate. The impact was like a physical shockwave. The pack didn't see a scandal. They saw their Alpha, a man who had been cold and distant for years, looking at this woman with a vulnerability and a joy they had never seen. They saw the way she looked back at him, her face radiant with a love that didn't need a title to be understood. Martha was the first to move. She stood up, her eyes misty, and bowed low. One by one, the other servants followed. Then the warriors. Then the elders. It wasn't a bow to a guest, it was a bow to the woman who had earned her place through fire and silence. Fenris led Rhea to the high table, but he didn't put her in a guest chair. He moved his own heavy chair to the center and had a second one placed right beside it. As they sat, the feast began, but the atmosphere had shifted from a celebration of the equinox to a celebration of a revelation. Rhea sat tall, the weight of the silk and the silver no longer feeling strange, but right. She looked out at the hall, at the people who used to look past her, and she realized the truth. She hadn't just revealed her identity to the palace. She had reclaimed herself. She wasn't Eli anymore. She wasn't a maid hiding in the dark. She was Rhea. And as Fenris leaned over to whisper a joke in her ear, making her laugh for the whole hall to see, she knew that the truth hadn't just set her free. It had given her a home. The Alpha took her hand under the table, his thumb stroking her palm just as it had in the library. No more hiding. No more coal dust. Only the light, the love, and the long, beautiful road ahead. The great hall was a whirlwind of music, laughter, and the clinking of goblets, but for Rhea, it felt like a dream she was watching from a great distance. The weight of the stairs, the kindness of the bows, and the sheer brightness of the torches were almost too much to bear after years of living in the gray safety of the shadows. Fenris must have felt the slight tremble in her hand, for he leaned close, his scent of cedar and mountain air anchoring her. "It is a lot to take in," he whispered, his voice a warm caress against her ear. "Come. Let us find the stars again." He led her away from the feast, through the heavy velvet curtains and out onto the great balcony. The air here was crisp and clean, tasting of snow and pine. Below them, the kingdom of the Iron Ridge stretched out like a sea of flickering orange lights, the hearths of thousands of families tucked into the valley. Above them, the sky was an endless tapestry of silver. Rhea walked to the stone railing, the blue silk of her dress fluttering in the breeze. She looked out at the horizon, her heart finally slowing to a peaceful rhythm. "I used to look at this view from the stable roof," she said softly. "I felt so small then. Like a speck of dust that the wind could just carry away." Fenris stepped up behind her. He didn't touch her yet, but she could feel the heat radiating from him, a protective wall against the cold night. "The wind could never carry you away, Rhea. You have roots deeper than the ancient oaks of this forest." He turned her gently to face him. The moonlight hit his face, softening the harsh lines of his brow, making him look not like a formidable alpha, but like a man standing on the edge of a great truth. "I have been a leader of men since I was 20, Fenris began, his voice low and steady. "I have heard 1,000 confessions. I have heard oaths of loyalty, pleas for mercy, and declarations of war. But I have never said the words that have been burning in my throat since the moment I stepped into that bathhouse." Rhea looked up at him, her breath hitching. The memory of that night, the freezing water, the terror, and the sudden, breathless silence flashed between them. "When I saw you there," Fenris continued, his eyes searching hers with an intensity that made her knees weak, "I thought I was looking at a ghost or a spirit of the woods. You were beautiful, yes. More beautiful than any song the bards sing. But it wasn't the beauty that stopped my heart." He reached out, his hand cupping her cheek. His thumb traced the line of her jaw, a touch so light it was almost a question. "It was the soul I saw in your eyes," he whispered. "I saw a woman who had every reason to be bitter, every reason to hate the world that had taken everything from her. And yet, there was no hate. There was only a fierce, quiet dignity. I saw the way you looked at the moon, as an equal, not a master. I loved you in that second, Rhea. Not because of who you were pretending to be, or even because of who your father was. I loved you because you were the first person I had ever met who was truly, completely brave." Tears blurred Rhea's vision, shimmering like diamonds in the moonlight. "I was just trying to survive, Fenris. I wasn't brave. I was terrified. Bravery isn't the absence of fear, my love, he said, the word love falling from his lips like a sacred vow. It is standing in the cold, dark water and choosing to keep your head held high anyway. For weeks, I watched you. I watched you be Eli, and I saw how you treated the smallest creatures with the same respect you gave the highest lords. I saw your wit in the library. I saw your tenderness when I was wounded. Every day, I fell further. Every day, I realized that I didn't just want you by my side, I needed you there. He stepped closer, closing the final inch between them. The world of the Iron Ridge, the politics of the pack, the secrets of the past, it all fell away. There was only the heartbeat of the man in front of her and the soul she had found in the dark. I love you, Rhea, he said, the confession finally free. With everything I am, and everything I will ever be. You are the Alpha's heart. You are my home. Rhea reached up, her fingers tangling in the soft fur of his collar, pulling him down toward her. And I love you, she breathed against his lips. I loved the man who left me blankets in the cold. I loved the man who danced with a maid in the starlight. I love you, Fenris. And then, he kissed her. It wasn't a kiss of conquest or demand. It was a soft, sweeping homecoming. It carried the weight of the years she had spent hiding, the weight of the books they had sorted, the weight of the blood she had cleaned from his side, and the weight of the dances they had shared in silence. It was the taste of rosemary and honey, of mountain rain and promised futures. As his arms wrapped around her, pulling her flush against his chest, Rhea felt the mate bond flare into a blinding, beautiful light. The search was over. The disguise was gone. She wasn't a servant, and he wasn't just a king. They were two souls, finally seen, finally held, and finally whole. Under the vast, witnessing sky of the Iron Ridge, the Alpha and the lady stood as one. The confession was made, the kiss was sealed, and for the first time in her life, Rhea wasn't afraid of the morning. Because she knew that no matter what the sun brought, she would never have to walk in the shadows again. The snow-capped peaks of the Iron Ridge were bathed in a rare, golden dawn. On this morning, the air didn't bite with the usual winter chill, instead, it felt charged with a holy, breathless anticipation. The great stone plaza before the palace was no longer a place of drills and mud. It had been transformed into a cathedral of the sky. Thousands of pack members had gathered, their voices a low, rhythmic hum that sounded like the very heartbeat of the mountain. They were not there to witness a conquest or a treaty. They were there to witness the completion of their Alpha's soul. Inside the palace, the final preparations were being made. Rhea stood in the center of the royal chambers, but she wasn't looking at the mirror. She was looking at the woman reflected there, a woman who no longer had to lower her eyes or smudge her face with soot. She wore a gown of pure, ivory velvet, embroidered with silver threads that traced the constellations of the northern sky. Over her shoulders hung a cloak of white wolf fur, the traditional mantle of the pack's matriarch. It was heavy, a physical weight that symbolized the burden and the beauty of leadership, but Rhea stood tall under it. The Eli who had once huddled in a drafty stable was gone, but she had kept that girl's heart, a heart that knew the value of every soul, no matter how small. A soft knock sounded on the door. It wasn't a servant. It was Fenris. He entered the room, looking every bit the king of the ridge in his black and silver regalia. But when he saw her, the Alpha's mask vanished. He stopped in his tracks, his breath catching in a way that made Rhea smile. It was the same look he had given her in the bathhouse, and in the library, and on the balcony, a look of pure, unadulterated wonder. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice a low, tender rumble. "I have been ready since the moment you gave me that first blanket, Fenris," she replied, walking toward him. He took her hand, his fingers interlaced with hers. "Today, the world learns what I have known from the start. You were never a servant. You were always our light." Together, they walked out onto the great stone dais overlooking the plaza. The roar of the crowd was instantaneous, a sound of thunder that shook the very foundations of the palace. But as Fenris raised his hand, the silence that followed was even more powerful. It was the silence of respect. Fenris stepped forward, his voice carrying to the furthest edge of the valley. People of the Iron Ridge. For too long, we have measured strength only by the sharpness of a blade or the thickness of a wall. But true strength is found in the spirit that refuses to break. It is found in the heart that chooses kindness when the world offers only coldness. He turned to Rhea, his eyes shining with a pride that brought tears to her eyes. "This is Rhea," he declared. "She was a ghost in our halls, but she became the conscience of our home. She saw our wounds and healed them. She saw our shadows and brought the moon. Today, I do not just name her my wife. I name her your Luna." The elder of the pack, a man whose hair was as white as the mountain peaks, stepped forward carrying a crown of ancient silver and moonstones. He didn't place it on her head immediately. He looked into Rhea's eyes, seeing the scholar's daughter, the stable hand, and the woman. "Do you swear to protect the weak, to guide the lost, and to love this pack as your own blood?" the elder asked. "I swear it," Rhea said, her voice clear and unwavering. "Because I have been the weak, I have been the lost, and I know that every member of this pack is a treasure worth guarding." The crown was placed upon her brow. It was light, but it felt like a seal upon her soul. Fenris stepped beside her, and together they raised their joined hands toward the sky. A great howl rose from the thousands below, a song of joy, of acceptance, and of a new era. It was the sound of a pack finally becoming whole. The seasons turned, as they always do in the ridge. The snow melted into spring, and the spring bloomed into a lush, green summer. But the change in the palace was permanent. The Luna's wing became a place of learning and refuge. Rhea opened the royal library to the children of the servants, teaching them the star reading and the histories her father had loved so much. The stables were rebuilt, warmer and brighter than they had ever been, because the Luna remembered what it was like to shiver in the dark. One evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the peaks in shades of violet and gold, Fenris and Rhea walked through the gardens. They weren't surrounded by guards or advisors. They were just two people, walking hand in hand. They passed the old bathhouse, now a place of warmth and healing for the pack's injured. Fenris stopped, looking at the stone building, then back at his wife. He pulled her into his arms, tucking her head under his chin just as he had done on the night of the hidden wound. "Sometimes I still can't believe it," he murmured into her hair. "That I almost let you go. That I almost missed the miracle standing right in front of me." Rhea pulled back, her amber eyes bright with a happiness that felt eternal. "You didn't miss it, Fenris. You chose to see. Most people look with their eyes, but you looked with your heart." He leaned down, kissing her brow, then her lips, a kiss that tasted of peace and 1,000 tomorrows. The story of the Wolf King and his hidden maid became a legend in the Iron Ridge, whispered by mothers to their pups and sung by bards around the winter fires. But the message of the story was always the same, that power is nothing without mercy, and that the greatest disguise in the world cannot hide a soul that is meant to shine. Love, they said, doesn't need a crown to recognize a queen. It only needs the courage to look past the soot and the shadows to the light that burns within. And in the heart of the Iron Ridge, that light never faded. They led together, they loved together, and they lived a life that was the greatest truth of all. The shadows were gone. The moon was full. And they were finally, beautifully, home. The story of Rhea and Fenris teaches us that true power lies in the heart, not the title. Key lessons. Rhea, true sight, look beyond the disguise others wear. Real connection happens when we see the soul, not just the status. Rhea, quiet strength, resilience isn't always a roar, sometimes it's the quiet dignity of surviving a long winter. Rhea, vulnerability, even the strongest alpha needs a safe place to land. Sharing our wounds is what truly binds us together. Rhea, defying labels, your current place doesn't define your destiny. You are more than the roles the world gives you. No matter how deep the shadows, a heart that stays true will always find its way home. Thank you for following the legend of Wolf King Dominion. Until the next legend unfolds, keep your eyes on the stars and your heart on the truth. Make sure to howl at that like button and subscribe.